These are my scale 75 alchemy metallics. This is a dwarf who's going to need a metallic in his color scheme. And this is how I'm deciding on which gets on him. So the idea here is I want to pick one of these metallics at random to make a color scheme around. So it's not going to be the only paint on him. I do get to use all my other paints. But the idea is I want to choose what his metallics are going to be first, and then I'll decide on the color scheme for it. And I'll be choosing randomly from this box. Now, there's a whole bunch of golds and bronzes in here, which means we could end up with a really boring dwarf. And, well, not boring, but, you know, either your usual dwarf. But there's also violets and pink metallics. So this should be interesting. No editing here. So gotta put my mask on. I'll give it up a really good mix. I cannot see out of this. Alright, so I have no idea what I will be pulling out. And it's gonna be this one, which is the Garnet Alchemy. So this, I think, is pinkish red, so it'll dry more red than pink. So I think I dodged a bullet a little bit, but still have to come up with something original for this. The dwarf I had mentioned will be this champion / leader bean from One Page Rules. Because he's wearing a bear pelt as a hat and has a cloak, the metallics will be kind of all over the place. His runes, his shoulders, his trim, his axes, meaning I'm gonna have to come up with colors that complement almost every bit of metallic. So I figured to get my brain chugging along, I'd start by base coating all the metallic parts. Give me a sense of what it looks like. When I do metallics, I like to start with mostly just paint with a little bit of the metallic mixed in. This way I can blend up to the pure metallic. Normally I'd have to add silver to highlight further, but in this case, this is going to be my only metallic, so I might just have to go with a lighter normal paint. If I keep the highlight sparse, that might not be too bad. When it comes to some of his natural parts, like the bear and the leather, I'm just going to let those be those. So the bear I can make black, brown, or white depending on what kind of bear I want. I think the red metallic would go well with a warm brown bear, so that's what I'm going to go with here. For the leather, I felt like I had 3 options. Option 1, complement the red metal with the red leather, but then I think it'd be too red. Option 2, make it brown and beige like all good leather recipes. But then I thought it might clash with the bear too much since I do want the bear to stand out a bit. So option 3 is what I'm going with here, a black leather, but with a bit of yellow mixed in to keep some color, and I'll be texturing it with some bone, probably instead of white. For his clothes, this is where I can either be a genius, or it'll be completely silly. I want to go with Iron Man colors, so complement the red with the yellow. I fear it'll end up too bright and not complement the red metallic at all, or it'll be perfect and they'll cheer my name in the streets. Because of those fears, I'm starting with a very dark yellow, mixed in with the brown so that A, it'll give a better base coat, and B, leave me with something to highlight up to without going overboard. With A though, it still took a good 3 thin coats to make it look smooth. Dwarf skin is dwarf skin, and I didn't want to deviate too much away from that, so I'm just going with a common dwarf skin, which is why I painted it off camera. But when it comes to his tidy beard, that's what I have to decide on. Since so far I've gone with mostly complementary colors, I'm going to stick with that and give him a nice bright fiery beard, using a more golden yellow later. For now, just a saturated red-orange base coat. At this point I think I'm starting to get a Dragon Guard vibe from the colors I've picked. Last little bit to fill in is the wood, and I'm not going to be deviating too much on that either, just a basic brown for that. And since this is the last color, I can start finishing them as well. So for the wood, I painted some grain lines and broke them again. This is where he snapped from the intro, so it's a bit of a thin connection, but once that was fixed, I finished and gave it a lacquer shine with some brown ink. Now I'm kind of tracing backwards through all the steps to finish them off. So for the skin, I'm just doing a couple lighter layers on the base skin with white mixed in each time. But when I get to the end, I feel he's a bit too cool skinned, it's too blue, and so bring back some of the rosy with a few really thin layers of red paint. The base coat of the leather was too bright to start, so I'm giving it a wash of black with some medium to darken it up. Otherwise it might end up being just a gray leather. Not that ashy isn't in theme at this point in time. Then I just go around with a lighter yellow grays, brightening up the edges. Now I have a habit of being either too generous or too sparing with these edge highlights. And when I look at some master painters' works, they're not as neat with them as I have in my head. So to that end, I'm just being wild about these highlights, keeping them towards points of light but not stressing otherwise. Just getting it to a bright enough highlight that they've got an overall texture. For the back, I do a normal wet blend. Add wet paint in one color to the top, then wash my brush, and starting just below it, paint up into the other color, then down again. And at the base of the cloak, wash my brush again, and add more of the yellow to blend up from the base. It's possible to do on the small parts on the front too, like I do here. But mostly I prefer to loaded brush for smaller areas where I have the base color on the brush, and then just add a dot of the darker color and start in the edge and blend it out that way. Then to highlight, I think my best bet is to stipple a lighter yellow into the highlighted areas, leaving some texture and not covering up too much of the blending I just did. The bear pelt, I started with just kind of sketching in the highlights. I was using my brush with a non-fine tip, and I was a bit too lazy to switch, so I ended up with a pretty thick opaque highlights. But the color wasn't making me happy either. It didn't seem very bear-like. So I did a reverse wet blend, where I wash over these very bright highlights, but wet blending between my wash colors, in this case black and the same ink I used on the wood. If they're thin enough, I get a blending effect not only between the wash colors, but also blending out the highlights a bit. Last quick thing will be his glorious beard. Already a bright red, I paint over it following the hair with a mix of red and orange, and gradually just layer more over the top with more orange and eventually yellow, until it looks nice and vibrant, but not too bright. I do want it to represent a red beard after all. Now for the main event. I re-base coated the main, and only metallic. It starts off pretty dark with black and red oxide mixed in with very little of the actual metallic. This way we have a nice dark base to start from, gradually getting more and more metallic. So in that base I've added more of the metallic and a bit more red oxide. I'll use this to layer the basic shape of the highlights. In this way it's almost like a non-metal metal, but metal which is so metal. But really, I find in photographs metallics have a habit of showing off what your eye doesn't see when it comes to where the flakes of metallic are. So by painting it like you would an the overall look will feel the same in both real life and pictures. Now that the base outline is done, I add more metallics to my mix, layering it like I would any other paint, adding texture when I can too. Finding my highlight points and sticking to them so I don't overfill the dark colors. When it comes time to highlight, I'm not sure I want to give it too much highlight as I don't have another metallic to highlight with. So I'd end up losing much of that garnet alchemy with too many layers. So I add a bit of the yellow and white, just enough to make it a tad brighter, and get just the sharp edges with this, adding points along the way to soft corners like the buckles. Last thing I did was to clean up the rune armor a bit with a deep black oxide wash, just because it felt like the details weren't sharp enough. And here we have the final model. Having pulled the garnet alchemy out of the box, I knew almost right away that I was going to end up with a non-traditional dwarf scheme. Normally you'd think of gold and bright colors, whereas here, he's very dark overall, and quite rough. Even his beard doesn't stand out too much from the other parts. But that is what I was going for. The eye doesn't focus too hard on one thing, which means I feel like I did a pretty okay job on making sure the garnet alchemy worked its way seamlessly into the scheme. This was a fun little exercise, and I'd say a great way to come up with color schemes if you're having troubles determining one of your own. Making yourself have to include a specific color is a great way to motivate other color choices, though I do suspect that's how we end up with a lot of pink armies. thanks for coming on this journey with me, and please consider subscribing for more painting adventures like this one.